The sphagnum moss, also known as peat moss or bog moss, sphagnum single-handedly builds and maintains entire wetland ecosystems. Its unique leaf structure containing large hollow dead cells called hyaline cells that make up as much as 80% of the plant's total volume and allow it to soak up between 16 and 26 times its own dry weight in water. As the moss grows and dies in layers over centuries, it releases hydrogen ions into the surrounding water in exchange for calcium and magnesium, a process that steadily acidifies its environment and creates the low-oxygen, waterlogged conditions responsible for forming peat bogs across the northern hemisphere. That same acidic anaerobic environment slows decomposition so dramatically that ancient human and animal remains preserved in peat bogs have been recovered, still recognizable after thousands of years underground. A single teaspoon of squeezed sphagnum water can contain tens of thousands of microscopic organisms, an entire miniature ecosystem of algae, rotifers, and amoebas that forms the base of the food web supporting everything else living in a healthy bog. Because commercially harvested sphagnum regenerates from the surface layer within just 1 to 3 years after careful removal, it remains one of the few wild harvested horticultural materials considered genuinely renewable when managed responsibly. Individual bogs can accumulate peat at a rate of roughly 1 millimeter per year, meaning a deposit several meters thick represents thousands of years of continuous, uninterrupted moss growth stacked quietly beneath the living surface layer. That extraordinarily slow accumulation rate means peatlands disturbed by large-scale harvesting can take centuries to fully recover their original depth, even when the living surface itself regrows within just a few years. The haircap moss. Towering over nearly every other moss species on Earth, Polytrichum commune can reach stem lengths exceeding 27 inches under ideal conditions, making it the tallest moss known to science by a considerable margin. That height comes from an internal structure unusually sophisticated for a moss, with specialized conducting tissue running through the stem that functions similarly to the vascular systems found in far more complex plants, allowing water and nutrients to travel efficiently over that unusual distance. This same tissue differentiation makes haircap moss a genuine scientific outlier among mosses, most of which lack any comparable internal plumbing and instead rely entirely on simple surface absorption to move water through their much shorter stems. Every entry on this list represents a genuinely different survival strategy within one of the oldest plant lineages on Earth, and Garden's lab keeps mapping out the moss world in detail, with a new deep dive posted every few days for anyone curious exactly what tiny green world might already be growing in their own backyard. Individual leaves curl tightly inward around the stem during dry periods to reduce water loss, then visibly unfurl again within roughly a minute of receiving fresh moisture. A rapid, almost animated response easy to observe simply by misting a dry patch. Male and female reproductive structures grow on entirely separate plants, and the male shoot tip develops a small, flower-like rosette structure each year that has earned the species nicknames, including Great Goldilocks and Great Golden Maidenhair among longtime moss enthusiasts. The cushion moss, forming dense, rounded, pillow-like mounds scattered across forest floors throughout eastern North America, Leucobrium glaucum owes its distinctive pale, silvery green color to a leaf structure containing multiple layers of large, empty, water-storing cells stacked above its thin layer of actual photosynthetic tissue. That water storage capacity lets individual cushions swell noticeably after rainfall and shrink back down during dry spells, giving established colonies a visibly different silhouette depending on recent weather. Unlike creeping mosses that spread flat across a surface, cushion moss grows radially outward from a central point in every direction at once, producing those characteristic rounded, dome-shaped clumps that can eventually merge together into sprawling mats covering significant patches of forest floor. The species thrives specifically in the acidic, well-drained soil conditions found beneath pine and oak canopies, often growing directly alongside the fallen needles and leaf litter that help maintain exactly the soil chemistry it prefers. Because established cushion moss colonies can persist for years without any real maintenance once settled into a shaded, undisturbed spot, this species has become a favorite among gardeners, specifically cultivating Japanese-style moss gardens seeking that soft, rounded, sculptural texture. Individual mounds can grow surprisingly large over time, occasionally exceeding a foot across in older, undisturbed colonies that have gone years without any disruption to their slow, radial expansion. The fern moss. Spreading in loose, feathery mats across shaded, moist ground, the Thuidium delicatulum earns its common name through a genuinely striking resemblance to a miniature fern. Its finely divided, triangular fronds branching repeatedly into smaller and smaller segments that create an intricate, lacy texture unlike the simpler leaf structure found in most other common moss species. That elaborate branching pattern happens through what botanists call pinnate and bipinnate growth, the same repeated branching structure that gives true ferns their own recognizable frond shape, an example of two entirely unrelated plant lineages independently evolving a strikingly similar form. Fern moss grows particularly well in the dappled shade of deciduous forests, often carpeting fallen logs, tree bases, and shaded slopes across a wide range spanning most of eastern North America and parts of Europe. Because it tolerates a moderate range of soil moisture and pH better than many more specialized moss species, fern moss has become a popular, relatively forgiving choice for shaded garden beds and woodland-style landscaping, where a soft, textured ground cover is wanted without excessive maintenance. Its delicate appearance belies genuine toughness, since established colonies readily bounce back from foot traffic, fallen debris, and seasonal drought that would visibly damage more fragile moss species growing in the same conditions. The Java moss. Despite its globally recognized name, Taxiphyllum barbieri has no confirmed connection whatsoever to the Indonesian island of Java, with the only verified wild population ever documented located instead near Vinh, Vietnam, following the species' original scientific description in 1911. That geographic mix-up has never slowed its popularity since Java moss remains one of the most widely kept aquarium plants on Earth, prized specifically for tolerating an enormous range of water temperatures, lighting conditions, and water chemistry that would stress or kill most other aquatic plants. Rather than true roots, the plant anchors itself using thin, hair-like structures called rhizoids that grip onto rocks, driftwood, and gravel purely for physical attachment, absorbing essentially all of its actual nutrients directly through its stems and leaves instead. Aquarists specifically value the dense, tangled mats it forms for the shelter and biofilm food source they provide to fish fry, shrimp, and other small, vulnerable aquarium inhabitants trying to avoid larger tank mates. For decades, the species was mistakenly sold and documented under the name Vesicularia dubiana, a genuinely different moss entirely. A naming confusion so persistent throughout the aquarium trade that some retailers and hobbyists still use the outdated name interchangeably today. The rose moss. Also called resurrection moss, Centrichia ruralis survives conditions that would permanently kill nearly every other plant on Earth, curling into a dry, seemingly lifeless brown clump for months or years at a time before fully reviving to vivid green growth within hours of finally receiving water again. Laboratory testing has documented specimens successfully reviving after being kept completely desiccated for as long as 17 consecutive years, and some individual shoots have survived brief laboratory exposure to temperatures reaching 120 degrees Celsius without losing their ability to eventually regenerate. That extraordinary resilience stems from specialized genes activated only during the drying process itself, essentially reprogramming the plant's cellular machinery to survive a level of internal water loss that would irreversibly destroy the proteins and membranes inside almost any other living cell. Researchers studying this species have found its desiccation survival genes share deep evolutionary roots with mechanisms flowering plants use to protect seeds during dormancy, suggesting rose moss may hold genuine clues for eventually engineering more drought-resistant food crops. That shared genetic ancestry stretches back roughly 450 million years, connecting a modest, easily overlooked rock-dwelling moss directly to survival strategies still shaping how the world's major food crops endure drought today. Found across dry, exposed rock and soil surfaces on nearly every continent, rose moss represents one of the oldest and most successful survival strategies in the entire 450 million year history of plants colonizing dry land. The feather moss, blanketing the forest floor across vast stretches of the boreal forest spanning Scandinavia, Russia, and Canada. Pleurozium shrubbery ranks among the most ecologically dominant single moss species found anywhere on the planet. Its feathery, reddish-stemmed shoots forming continuous carpets across millions of acres of northern coniferous woodland. That sheer scale gives feather moss an outsized role in regulating an entire ecosystem's water cycle and soil temperature. Its dense, absorbent mat insulating the ground beneath it and slowing the seasonal thaw of permafrost in the coldest reaches of its range. Despite lacking any true roots or vascular tissue, feather moss hosts an entire community of nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria living directly on its leaf surfaces, quietly contributing a meaningful share of the total nitrogen entering many boreal forest ecosystems each year. The species grows so slowly and persists so reliably across stable forest floor conditions that researchers use feather moss growth patterns as a genuine long-term indicator of forest disturbance history, since undisturbed stands can maintain continuous moss cover for many decades at a stretch. Its soft, feathery texture and rich green to golden brown coloring have also made feather moss a popular choice for floral arrangements and terrarium landscaping, harvested commercially from managed boreal forest tracts across its native range. Because it thrives specifically in the cool, moist, low-light conditions typical of dense conifer canopy, feather moss rarely establishes successfully in warmer or drier climates outside its natural boreal and subarctic range. The Spanish moss, draping in long silvery gray strands from live oak and bald cypress branches across the American South, Spanish moss has spent centuries being called a moss, despite belonging to an entirely different plant family altogether. A genuine flowering bromeliad more closely related to the pineapple than to any true moss covered elsewhere on this list. Tillandsia usnioides produces no roots whatsoever, instead absorbing water and nutrients directly through tiny scale-like structures called trichomes covering its thread-like stems and leaves, structures that also give the plant its distinctive silvery appearance when dry and its brighter green color immediately after rain. Despite hanging from living trees, Spanish moss causes no direct harm to its host, drawing no nutrients from the tree itself and functioning purely as an epiphyte using the branches as physical support rather than as any kind of parasitic connection. The plant reproduces both through tiny, wind-dispersed seeds and by simply fragmenting, with broken pieces easily carried by wind or birds to establish entirely new colonies on distant branches. Historically harvested commercially by the ton for use as furniture padding, mattress stuffing, and even automobile seat cushioning throughout the early 20th century, Spanish moss today serves a quieter but genuinely important ecological role, providing nesting material and shelter for numerous bird species that build their homes directly within its hanging strands. The plant's misleading common name traces back to early French settlers, who reportedly compared its long gray-green strands to the beards worn by Spanish conquistadors, a nickname that gradually softened from Spanish beard into the more familiar Spanish moss still used today.